Want to know a secret that completely changes the usual perception of the Wild West? We are used to thinking that pioneers slept in sturdy log cabins, sheltered from all the threats of the harsh frontier. But what if I told you that for most families, nighttime was not a time of rest, but a time of trial, a test of nerves, endurance, and the ability to remain calm when surrounded by utter darkness? Their homes were not fortresses at all. Thin walls let in the cold, sound, and fear that grew with every passing minute. Beyond the dim light of a kerosene lamp lay a world where every crackle, every gust of wind, and especially every distant, barely audible howl became an alarm signal. The night on the prairies was not quiet. It had a life of its own, and every family knew that even the imagination could become an enemy if allowed to run wild. And that is why sleep became a carefully thought-out strategy. The settlers chose who would sleep closest to the door, set up improvised alarm traps, kept their weapons close at hand, and divided up the night watches so that at least someone would remain on guard. Psychological pressure was combined with physical pressure. Cold, fatigue, and a complete lack of protection from the outside world forced them to look for any way to maintain a sense of control. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how settler families adapted to the fear of the night. What tricks helped them not to go mad from the silence and darkness, and what psychological and physical methods allowed them to survive night after night, until the very dawn that meant they had won another battle for survival. What if I told you that everything you believed about the impregnable huts of the pioneers was not true? We imagine these structures as small fortresses capable of withstanding any siege by the wilderness. In reality, the log cabin was more of a psychological barrier than a physical one. It was a barrier that separated the family's civilization from the chaos of the outside world. But it was an incredibly permeable barrier. The freshly cut logs from which the dwelling was hastily constructed were full of moisture. During the first year, they dried out, warped, and settled, creating new cracks and gaps. It was a living, breathing house in the most literal sense, and it breathed with drafts and sounds. Every gust of wind seemed to pass through the walls, bringing with it the smells and cold of the night prairie. The space between the logs, known as chinking, was the Achilles heel of any log cabin. It was filled with whatever was available, a mixture of clay, moss, grass, or even old rags. This material was constantly chipped away, washed away by rain, or blown away by the wind. Maintaining the seal was a never-ending daily task, and at night, any missed gap became a source of anxiety. It was through these imperfections in the walls that sound penetrated inside with frightening clarity. The howl of a wolf or the cry of a cougar did not just come from afar. It felt as if the source of the sound was only a few steps away from the bed. Wood, especially damp wood, served as an excellent resonator, amplifying and distorting the nighttime noises, turning them into something more sinister. The walls did not so much block the sound as filter it, cutting off the familiar and letting through the disturbing. The family listening in the darkness could clearly distinguish the crack of a branch under someone's weight or the snort of a horse in the pen. This created a paradoxical effect. The house was a shelter that forced its inhabitants to be in constant tension, listening to what was happening outside. Even the door, however sturdy it might seem, was more of a symbol of protection. It was made of thick planks, often nailed together without a single nail, and locked with a heavy wooden bolt. But the very sound of that bolt grinding into place was more of a ritual of self-reassurance than a real guarantee of safety. Windows, if there were any, were even more vulnerable. In the early days of frontier settlement, glass was an incredible luxury. Most often, window openings were covered with oiled paper or thin tanned leather. These materials let in dim light, but were completely transparent to sound and cold. The chimney, made of stones and clay, was another channel of communication with the outside world. It not only brought the howling of the wind, but also, as many believed, could become a way for small predators to enter. Although this was unlikely, fear forced the pioneers to close the damper tightly at night, risking suffocation from the smoke of smoldering coals. Thus, the hut was not a fortress, it was a membrane vibrating in unison with the wild. Sleeping in such a house was an act of trust. Trust in a thin layer of wood, clay, and one's own luck. The pioneers slept not despite the sounds, but with them, having learned to live on this thin line. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how such imperfect housing affected the psychology of the people who lived in it? Was it a constant source of stress, or did it become a familiar backdrop over time? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about real life on the frontier. Are you ready to learn the truth about what settlers actually heard at night? The soundscape of the night frontier was incredibly rich and frightening to the unaccustomed ear. It was not silence as we understand it. It was a chorus of sounds, each carrying information, most often alarming. First and foremost was the wind. On the Great Plains or in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the wind never stopped. It didn't just blow, it howled, moaned, and whistled as it passed through canyons and tall grass. This monotonous hum was the backdrop against which any other, more abrupt sound stood out with frightening clarity. The second layer was the sounds of the cabin itself. As we have already said, the house was alive. The logs, cooling after the heat of the day, made loud cracks and clicks, like footsteps. The wooden roof groaned under the gusts of wind, and the oiled paper on the windows vibrated with a low, drumming hum. It was against this backdrop that the family learned to distinguish the sounds of the wild. The crack of a dry branch could mean anything from a harmless deer to a sneaking predator, or, worse, an uninvited guest. The ability to distinguish the sound of a broken branch from the sound of a twig falling in the wind was a vital skill. Of course, the most recognizable and frightening sound was the howling of wolves. It wasn't just the howling we hear in movies. It was a complex system of communication for the pack, which could sound frighteningly close even when the wolves were a mile away from the house. The howling echoed off the hills, creating the illusion that the pack was surrounding the cabin. Pioneers quickly learned to read these sounds. A short, sharp bark could mean that the pack had found prey or was simply playing. But a long, drawn-out, multi-voiced howl, rising and falling, was a territorial cry that meant, "We are here, and this is our land." It was this sound that made people close their shutters more tightly. No less frightening were the sounds that were absent. Absolute sudden silence in the middle of the night was a bad sign. If the crickets and frogs suddenly fell silent, it meant that someone large and dangerous was nearby. This ringing silence was an alarm signal that made the head of the family silently pick up his gun. Families who lived near rivers or streams could hear the splash of water, which could mask other sounds. But they could also hear the cries of nocturnal birds such as owls. The hooting of an owl, which could easily be mistaken for a woman's scream, gave rise to many superstitions and scary stories around the campfire. Then there was livestock. Settlers kept their few animals, a cow, horse, or mule, in primitive pens near the house. The anxious neighing of a horse or the mooing of a cow was the surest indicator that someone was indeed outside. Animals sensed predators long before humans could hear them. This constant auditory vigilance was incredibly exhausting. Pioneers, in essence, never slept deeply. Their sleep was shallow, intermittent, ready to be interrupted at any moment by a new unfamiliar sound. This was the price of living on the frontier of civilization. But listening was not enough. It is one thing to hear a threat, but quite another to be prepared for it. In the next chapter, we will learn what mandatory evening rituals turned a simple hut into a bastion, and how the psychology of order helped to combat the chaos of the night. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. The survival of the pioneers depended not on weapons, but on ritual. What I'm about to show you was a daily routine, but no less important for that. At dusk, when the shadows began to lengthen and merge, the entire life of the pioneer family switched to defense mode, and a strict ritual of closing the house began. This process was not just a set of mechanical actions. It was a psychological practice designed to create a sense of security. The ritual began with checking the perimeter. The father of the family or the older sons walked around the outside of the hut, checking the cattle pen, putting away tools that might attract attention, and inspecting the walls for new cracks. Then it was time for the internal fortifications. The first thing was the door. It was not just a lock and key. The real protection was a massive wooden bar, the door bar. This bar was inserted into heavy brackets mounted in the wall itself on either side of the doorway. The process of installing this bar was symbolic. The sound of the heavy wood sliding and thudding into place was a signal to the whole family. We are safe, the outside world is cut off. This sound was as important as the physical barrier itself, which was almost impossible to break down from the outside. Next, the windows were checked. If the house had wooden shutters, they were tightly closed and locked from the inside with wooden latches or hooks. If the window openings were covered with oiled paper, they were inspected for tears and reinforced, sometimes even covered with a heavy blanket at night. The hearth and chimney were the next points of attention. The fire in the hearth was a source of heat and light, but also a vulnerability. At night, the fire was banked. Large logs were covered with a thick layer of ash so that they would smolder until morning, providing heat but without creating a bright flame or dangerous sparks. This also reduced the draft, making the sound of the wind in the chimney less deafening. Weapons occupied a place of honor. Loaded muskets or rifles were not stored in a cupboard. They were hung on wooden hooks above the fireplace or placed in the corner by the door, where they could be reached in an instant without getting out of bed. A bag of bullets and a horn of gunpowder were always kept nearby. Even the most mundane items were placed with nighttime defense in mind. For example, a bucket of water was always placed by the door, not only for morning needs, but also in case it was necessary to extinguish a fire or simply to create an additional obstacle. Any noise from an overturned bucket would wake up the whole family. This ritual was important not only for adults. All family members knew their roles. While the adults were busy with serious matters, the rest cleared the table and made the beds, creating an orderly and predictable environment. The order inside contrasted with the chaos outside. Once all the preparations were complete, the family would gather together, often for a short prayer or simply for a few minutes of silence. It was a moment of unity in the face of the night. They would sit by the smoldering hearth, and it was the last moment of light and relative calm before plunging into darkness. When the last candle or torch went out, the house was plunged into almost complete darkness. Now the only barriers left were those erected in the last hour, and the family's collective belief that these barriers would be enough. If you find this information important, please like this video. Are you ready for the shocking truth? Sleep on the frontier was a luxury that not everyone could afford at the same time. Even after all the rituals had been observed and the house was plunged into darkness, at least one person in the family often remained on guard. The concept of night duty was an unwritten law of survival. Most often, this role was taken on by the head of the family. The father, comfortably seated in a chair by the smoldering hearth, could spend several hours this way. He did not sleep, but dozed, alert, with a rifle on his knees, ready to react to any suspicious sound that penetrated the howling wind. It was an informal duty dictated by instinct and responsibility. In particularly dangerous areas or during periods when wolves were especially active, the duty could be shared. First, the father would stay awake for several hours. Then the mother would take over if she was strong enough. Sleep in such a situation was fitful and restless. People did not lie down in bed, but remained seated in their clothes. This allowed them to save precious seconds in case of an alarm. It was enough to simply open your eyes, grab your rifle, and be ready for action. The fire in the hearth played a dual role here. The smoldering coals provided a little light, allowing them to make out the vague outlines of the room and not feel completely in the dark. But more importantly, the red glow of the coals on the oiled paper window could serve as a deterrent to anyone watching the house from outside. The psychological pressure on the guard was enormous. Hours spent in silence and darkness sharpened the hearing to the limit. The imagination began to paint the most frightening pictures, and every crack of a log in the wall seemed like the footsteps of an enemy. It was a battle not only with external threats, but also with internal demons. Simple means were used to maintain alertness. A mug of hot water left by the hearth from the evening, or simply the need to constantly throw small chips of wood onto the coals. Sometimes the guard could quietly do some small work, repairing harnesses or sharpening a knife using the dim light of the coals. The presence of such a guard reassured the rest of the family. The very fact that someone was awake and guarding their sleep allowed the others to sink into a deeper and more restorative rest. It was a manifestation of care, a silent sacrifice for the well-being of loved ones. This watch was not a rule every night. In peaceful times when threats seemed distant, the whole family could sleep. But after any alarming incident, whether it was the howling of wolves too close for comfort or tracks found in the morning near the corral, the ritual of night watch resumed immediately. This practice shows how fragile the pioneers' world was. Safety was not a given. It was the result of nightly efforts and constant vigilance. Sleep was not a right, but a privilege that had to be guarded. But how did those who did not have to keep watch sleep? In the next chapter, we will talk about the closest and most important bastion of safety, the communal bed, and how it was arranged. Are you ready to learn how the geography of sleep helped people survive? In a typical pioneer cabin, consisting of a single room, space was the greatest luxury. The concept of separate bedrooms was unknown. Therefore, sleep was a collective activity, and its organization was dictated by harsh necessity, warmth, and safety. The center of the sleeping area was one large, often homemade bed. It was made of rough planks and could be simply a wide platform covered with a mattress. This bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a real nest in which the whole family took refuge. Mattresses, or tiki, were another example of ingenuity. They were sewn from rough burlap and stuffed with whatever was available. In summer, it could be dry grass or moss, and in autumn, corn leaves. These mattresses were hard and rustled with every movement, but they were a barrier between the body and the cold boards. The arrangement of family members in this bed was not random. There was a strict hierarchy based on protection. Adults usually slept on the outer edges of the bed, acting as a living shield for those in the center. This shared sleeping arrangement, or co-sleeping, was not a choice, but the only way to survive the cold nights. In the prairies, where winter temperatures could drop to extremely low levels and firewood was always in short supply, the warmth of human bodies was the main source of heat. Sleeping in such cramped conditions was not always comfortable, but it provided an incomparable psychological sense of security. Physical contact with loved ones had a calming effect. Any change in breathing or restless movement of one family member was immediately felt by the others. Warmth was not the only reason. In a world full of real and imagined nighttime threats, physical closeness was a form of protection. An adult could react instantly if someone sleeping nearby began to stir or cry out from a nightmare. If the family was large, one bed was not enough. In this case, trundle beds were used. These were low platforms on wheels that rolled under the main bed during the day and were pulled out and made up at night. As the family grew, sleeping places were arranged in the attic, or loft. This was the space under the roof itself, which could be accessed by a ladder. It was warmer there, as the heat from the hearth rose upwards, but it was also scarier because of the noise of the wind and rain drumming on the roof. All these sleeping arrangements were dictated solely by pragmatism. Modesty or personal space were abstract concepts that gave way to the fundamental need for warmth and survival. Night turned the family into a single, cohesive organism, breathing in unison. What if I showed you a time machine? No, not a real one, but the one that pioneers built every night in an attempt to shut out the sounds of the outside world. The idea of soundproofing was foreign to them in the modern sense, but the instinctive desire to muffle frightening sounds led to interesting solutions. As we already know, log walls conducted sound very well. The first and most obvious way to combat this was to hang fabric on the walls. Any fabric that was in the house was used. Old blankets, worn-out clothes, burlap, and even tanned animal skins were all attached to the walls. This created a multi-layered barrier. The fabric absorbed some of the sound vibrations, making the acoustics in the room more muffled and cozy. Sounds from outside became less sharp, more muted. It wasn't silence, but it was a manageable, less disturbing noise. In addition, these curtains served another, equally important function. They provided an extra layer of insulation. An air gap formed between the fabric and the cold log wall, which helped to retain precious heat from the hearth. Another method was to work from the outside. Some settlers, especially in the Great Plains, where there were few trees but a lot of wind, resorted to banking their homes. They piled a thick layer of earth, turf, or even manure against the outer walls of the hut. This layer, which sometimes reached the middle of the wall, was incredibly effective. It served as a windbreak, a heat insulator, and most importantly, an excellent sound absorber. A hut dressed in such an earthen coat became much quieter and warmer, turning into a kind of dugout. The roof was also a field for experimentation. Simple wooden shingles provided excellent protection from rain, but they drummed loudly and let in the cold. Therefore, many pioneers preferred turf roofs. Layers of turf were laid on the frame with the grass facing down, and then another layer was added with the grass facing up. Such a roof was heavy and required strong walls, but its advantages were undeniable. In summer, it kept the house cool, and in winter, it kept it warm. And most importantly for our topic, it was almost completely soundproof. Neither the howling wind nor the pounding rain could penetrate the thick layer of earth. Of course, these methods had their drawbacks. The fabrics on the walls accumulated dust and could become a breeding ground for insects. The earthen embankment attracted rodents and led to the rotting of the lower logs. And the turf roof often leaked and required constant repair. Nevertheless, these efforts show how important acoustic comfort was to the pioneers. They instinctively understood that sound sleep was impossible in an environment full of disturbing noises. They fought for silence as desperately as they did for crops or safety. Their methods were primitive, but they worked, transforming the hut from a hollow resonator into a more or less quiet refuge. In this silence, one could finally relax and hear not the howling of wolves, but the calm breathing of one's family. But what happened when nature itself made such a racket that all these tricks became useless? In the next chapter, we'll talk about the night during the storm. For a pioneer family accustomed to the nighttime noises, a storm was a special kind of event. It was a night when the outside world invaded with such force that it was impossible to ignore. A thunderstorm on the Great Plains or a snowstorm in the Rocky Mountains brought with it a whole new set of sounds and fears. The first sign of an approaching storm was silence. That ringing, oppressive silence when the wind died down and all living creatures fell silent. Then came a distant, low rumble that gradually grew into a roar. The walls of the cabin began to vibrate even before the first raindrops fell. The thunderclaps on the prairie, where there were no tall buildings, were deafening. They sounded not like rolls of thunder, but like dry, sharp shots from a giant cannon that made the earth tremble. Each strike seemed to hit the roof directly, causing the whole family to shudder. The light from the lightning was no less frightening. Through the cracks in the walls and the oiled paper windows, the room was illuminated for a split second by a deathly white light. This flash brought out frightened faces and shadows from the darkness, which were immediately swallowed up again by the gloom. The rain turned into a continuous roar, drumming on the wooden roof. If the roof was thatched, the sound was muffled, but soon another problem arose: leaks. Water began to drip, first in one place, then in another, forcing buckets and bowls to be placed throughout the room. A winter blizzard, or blizzard, was even more frightening. It brought not only the deafening howl of the wind, but also the piercing cold. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, clogged the smallest cracks. In the morning, the family could wake up under a thin layer of snow covering the floor and blankets. During such a storm, the hut turned from a shelter into a besieged fortress. The walls groaned and creaked under the pressure of the wind, and it seemed as if they were about to collapse. The most vulnerable spot was the chimney. A strong gust of wind could knock it over or clog the chimney with snow, filling the room with acrid smoke. Paradoxically, during the most violent storms, the fear of wolves receded. The family understood that in such weather, no predator would waste its energy on hunting. All of wildlife, just like humans, would retreat to their burrows and shelters. The sound of the storm was so all-consuming that it drowned out all other fears. It was pure, primal chaos that could only be obeyed. The family huddled together, finding comfort not in silence, but in the collective experience of the elements. When the storm finally subsided, an extraordinary silence fell, which seemed deafening after hours of roaring. This silence was a reward for their steadfastness. It meant that the worst was over, that the hut had survived, and that dawn would soon break. We have talked a lot about physical threats, but often the most dangerous enemy of the pioneer was not the wolf, but his own imagination. Living in constant tension, listening to every sound, could not but affect the psyche. Developing psychological defenses was as important as building strong walls. One of the main defense mechanisms was what we would today call normalization. What seems extreme to us was everyday life for them. The howling of wolves was as much a part of the background as the noise of cars outside our windows. The brain learned to filter out this threat, reclassifying it from danger to noise. Fatalism and stoicism were key character traits necessary for survival. Pioneers accepted the fact that they could not control the wild. They could only control their reaction to it. Fear was a useless emotion that wasted energy, so it was suppressed or transformed into vigilance. Religion played a huge role in managing fear. Evening prayer was not just a ritual, but a way to convey one's anxieties to a higher power. Belief in divine providence and that their fate was in God's hands gave many families the strength to survive the darkest nights. The ritual of closing the house, which we talked about, was a powerful tool for combating anxiety. By performing a sequence of familiar, specific actions, bolting the door, checking the shutters, dousing the fire, a person gained the illusion of control over the situation. I did everything I could. This thought allowed them to go to bed with a more peaceful mind. Work was another remedy for fear. The pioneers were physically exhausted. After a whole day of hard labor in the fields, cutting down trees or tending livestock, they simply did not have the strength for long night vigils. Physical fatigue was the best sleeping pill, turning off the brain despite the disturbing sounds. Humor, even the darkest kind, also served as a defense. Telling stories around the campfire, even scary ones, was a way to talk through fear, to make it shared, and therefore less individual. By turning the wolf from a real threat into a fairy tale character, they partially neutralized it. The presence of family was the main source of comfort. Fear alone and fear surrounded by loved ones are two different feelings. Knowing that your partner was breathing nearby, that your loved ones were sleeping by your side, created an invisible barrier. They were not alone against the wilderness, they were a clan. Of course, it didn't always work. There were nights when fear took over, but the very structure of life on the frontier was designed to suppress that fear. Night was always followed by day, and with dawn came work that left no time for reflection. This psychological barrier was as important a part of defense as the wooden bolt on the door. The walls of the cabin protected the body, while routine, faith, and stoicism protected the mind. Without this second line of defense, survival on the frontier would have been impossible. Even with the strongest psychological defenses, the pioneers remained pragmatists. They understood that spirit and fortitude helped them survive many hardships, but there were threats against which inner qualities were powerless. In cases where nature, people, or circumstances became too dangerous, weapons became the only argument. They served not only as a means of defense, but also as a source of confidence. The knowledge that there was a means at hand to stop danger acted as the strongest reassurance. The pioneers perceived weapons not as a luxury, but as an element of everyday safety. They knew that faith could strengthen the spirit, and that familiarity with danger made them more resilient. But at the same time, they realized that predators, robbers, or uninvited guests would not disappear thanks to bravery or prayer. Therefore, weapons became an extension of their instinct for self-preservation. They were as much a part of their daily lives as fire or water. This was the harsh wisdom of the frontier. Life here did not allow for carelessness. For such cases, there was one last, most reliable argument. Weapons, which were always at hand. They were not hidden in chests or hung on decorative racks. They were nearby, within immediate reach. This was especially important at night, because unexpected threats often appeared in the dark. At such moments, speed of decision-making meant much more than caution. Therefore, weapons were kept where they could be found effortlessly. The central element of this defense system was, of course, a long-barreled rifle or musket. These barrels were not only a symbol of the frontier, but also the most important tool for survival. They protected against predators, helped to obtain food, and provided confidence. Pioneers handled their rifles as casually as modern people use their phones. They accompanied them on their travels and hunts, but even at night they did not leave their owners' hands. These weapons were considered a real help in any situation. It was not just a weapon, it was a tool for survival, a provider, and a protector. It was used to shoot deer and bison to feed the family. It was used to scare away coyotes that came too close to the farm. It was used to protect the house if someone tried to break in. That is why the rifle was kept in perfect condition, clean and in good working order. It was part of the family's values and was treated with respect. At night, it was not kept in a box, but close to the head of the family. He could wake up at any suspicious sound and immediately grab his weapon. In the dark, it was necessary to act quickly, and a distance of a few steps could be critical. Therefore, the rifle was kept so close that a person could reach it even while asleep. This allowed them to feel protected. This arrangement calmed many nerves. The most common storage place was two wooden hooks driven into the wall above the fireplace. This was a place that had been tested by generations of settlers. It was located in the center of the house, where it was always dry and warm. The rifle hung in plain sight, and if necessary, it could be removed with a single movement. The very presence of the weapon above the fire seemed to symbolize protection. It allowed the owner to sleep peacefully without fear of sudden danger. It was the perfect spot, central, dry, and within reach with just one step from the bed. The flames of the hearth dried the metal and wood, protecting them from corrosion. No moisture could penetrate the barrel or spoil the powder charge. In addition, the fireplace was a natural landmark in the dark, and the hand would automatically find the familiar position of the weapon. This arrangement made access to weapons quick and reliable. Convenience here was a matter of survival. The heat from the hearth also protected the weapon from destructive moisture. The pioneers knew very well that dampness could disable even the best rifle. Therefore, they made sure that the rifle never cooled down or got too damp. The heat also helped keep the flint and caps dry. In harsh winter conditions, this was especially important. The reliability of the weapon directly depended on such small details. If there was no space above the fireplace, the rifle was simply leaned against the wall next to the bed, with the butt facing down. This was the second most common storage method. It allowed the weapon to be grabbed in a split second, even if the person woke up from a sudden noise. In the dark, the hand could easily find the long barrel by touch. This arrangement made the weapon part of the nighttime space. It always remained the second guard next to the owner. Many pioneers slept with their hand literally resting on the cold metal of the barrel. This gave them a sense of confidence. There was nothing theatrical about this gesture. It was a practical solution. If they had to wake up suddenly, their hand and weapon were already won. The pioneer could get up and act without wasting a second searching. This made the nights calmer, despite all the dangers of the frontier. It was not only practical, but also had a calming effect, like a talisman. The weapon became a symbol of strength and control. For many pioneers, it embodied the hope that they would survive another night on the frontier of civilization. This confidence was an important part of life among the prairies and forests. People understood that their survival depended on themselves, and weapons reinforced this feeling. They became a psychological shield. Weapons were always loaded. This seemed like a natural solution for those who lived in a state of constant readiness. Unloaded weapons were considered useless on the frontier. Any threat could arise instantly, and there was no time to prepare to fire. Therefore, pioneers always carried weapons ready for immediate use. They were aware of the risk, but considered it necessary. This was contrary to modern safety rules. But on the frontier, an unloaded gun was a useless piece of wood and metal. There was no luxury of time here. There was no opportunity to think, measure out the powder, insert the bullet, and ram it down with a ramrod. In a critical situation, a second could mean the difference between life and death. Therefore, safety rules gave way to necessity. Pioneers acted according to the laws of survival. There was simply no time to measure out gunpowder and ram in a bullet in a critical situation. Predators or attackers did not wait for the pioneer to finish loading. That is why people live by the principle of constant readiness. They had no choice. The risk of an accidental shot was the price they paid for safety, and they paid it consciously. A kit for quick reloading was always kept next to the rifle. It was within reach so that the pioneer could use it even in the dark. This kit consisted of simple but necessary items. Each of them had been tested by experience. They made up a complete kit for emergency reloading. This allowed the owner to act quickly and confidently. The most eagerly awaited moment of each night was dawn. It was perceived not as another natural cycle, but as a real victory over time and fear. The appearance of soft morning light meant that the night-long ordeal was over, and the house had withstood all threats. Even the most resilient pioneers felt relief when the darkness began to recede and allowed them to make out the outlines of things. The feeling was almost physical, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Dawn became a symbol of hope. It was not just the beginning of a new day, it was the end of a battle. The night was perceived as a rigorous test that had to be endured in order to continue living in the harsh world of the frontier. Every night was filled with uncertainty, and so the morning became a real gift. When light penetrated the cracks in the hut, it seemed as if nature itself was blessing the new day. The pioneers felt that they had been given another chance at peaceful work and order. Dawn was a recognition of their resilience. The first gray streaks of light breaking through the oiled paper on the window were a signal that the most dangerous part of the day was over. These thin rays shone especially brightly against the blackness of the night, like someone's cautious steps into a world of safety. They penetrated the hut quietly but decisively, making it clear that the chaos of darkness had dissipated. The pioneers looked at this light with gratitude, knowing that they had survived another night. The light gently illuminated the things that had been hidden in the darkness. It gave them the confidence to continue living. Light changed everything. It not only illuminated the space, but also restored inner peace. All the objects that seemed threatening at night became part of the familiar routine in the morning. People saw that there was nothing dangerous nearby, and the tension eased. It was a moment of transition from anxiety to activity. This transition filled the morning with a special energy. It drove the shadows out of the corners, turning frightening silhouettes back into familiar objects. A chair, a barrel of flour, a spinning wheel. Nighttime fears dissolved along with the darkness. The same outlines that had seemed like enemies now only elicited a smile or relief in the morning. The silhouettes lost their hostility and became ordinary objects of domestic life. Even children, if there were any in the family, ceased to be afraid of what seemed alive at night. Light restored the mind's control over the imagination. The soundscape also changed. The anxious howling and hooting of owls was replaced by the familiar morning sounds. Birds singing, cows mooing. These sounds were familiar and warm. They signaled that life around them was continuing as usual. The morning voices of animals and birds created a sense of normality. The pioneers listened to them as attentively as they had listened to every suspicious rustle at night. But now these sounds brought reassurance. The first to rise was usually the head of the family. His awakening was quick and decisive, because the frontier did not allow for laziness. He rose as soon as he felt the light, as if an internal mechanism was pushing him to action. Sleep receded almost instantly. He knew that the day demanded attention and strength, and his first duty was to make sure that the night had passed safely. His first action was not washing or breakfast, but a ritual opposite to the evening one. The man did everything in the same tried and tested order that was followed day after day. This ritual began with checking the door and the surrounding area. It was part of an overall security system that helped keep his family alive. The man did everything quietly so as not to wake the others. This order was followed without exception. He approached the door and silently removed the heavy wooden bolt. His movements were cautious but confident. The bolt was a symbol of nighttime defense, and removing it meant that it was safe to relax. This moment was filled with both relief and vigilance. Even the morning did not negate the need to be on guard. But still, this action brought a sense of freedom. This sound, wood sliding against wood, was a signal to the whole family. The night is over. We have survived. In the hut, everyone could hear this sound, even if they were not yet fully awake. It became part of the family rhythm, a familiar sign of the beginning of the day. The children knew that after it, they could get up. The women understood that it was time to prepare breakfast. It was a sound that united everyone. The door opened slowly, cautiously. Even the morning light did not completely dispel the caution. The pioneer knew that something that had appeared during the night could be waiting behind the door. Therefore, he opened the door gradually so that he could see the entire yard at once. He watched every movement, and every time he did it as if he were repeating an important ritual. The first breath of fresh, cold morning air was a reward. The air seemed cleaner and brighter after the mustiness of the night. It awakened the body and cleared the mind. That first breath seemed to wash away the remnants of anxiety that had accumulated during the night. The pioneer allowed himself to just stand and breathe for a moment. But then he returned to his duties. But before relaxing, the pioneer conducted a morning check, a careful inspection of the perimeter. It was an important part of his responsibility. He had to understand what was happening around the hut while the family slept. The inspection allowed him to identify any threats or traces of uninvited guests. It was an opportunity to prepare for any surprises. Such a check was part of their survival. He walked around the hut, looking for any traces on the soft ground or snow that weren't there yesterday. The ground preserved traces better than any paper. Animal or human tracks could tell a whole story. His eyes noticed the slightest changes. He studied the ground like an experienced hunter or scout. Every trace was an important signal. This was a critical moment. Even a single fresh mark could change plans for the whole day. Danger could appear in the most unexpected places. The pioneers knew that nature did not forgive carelessness. Therefore, they were especially careful in the morning. This stage determined the entire schedule for the day. Wolf tracks near the corral, bear paw prints by the woodpile, or worse, unfamiliar shoe prints. All of this was information for planning the day and the following night. Every sign had to be analyzed. The wolves could return the following night. A bear could be nearby, and human footprints were the most alarming sign of all. Priorities changed depending on the information. It was a kind of frontier calendar. The pen was checked. Domestic animals were an important part of the farm, and their safety was paramount. Any sign of panic or anxiety could mean nocturnal predator activity. He carefully examined every detail. Even the slightest damage to the fence required attention. After all, the safety of the entire farm depended on it. We see that night on the frontier was not a time of rest, but a time of trial. The pioneer's sleep was not deep and peaceful. It was a sensitive, intermittent, and anxious process, balancing on the edge between reality and imagination. The family in the log cabin was not in a fortress, but on a small, poorly defended island in the middle of an ocean of wilderness. Every night required preparation, vigilance, and psychological fortitude. The walls, rituals, shared bed, and weapons at the head of the bed were all part of a complex system designed not for comfort, but for survival. This daily struggle for the right to simply rest shows us the true price of settling new lands. It was measured not only in hard work and danger, but also in the enormous psychological pressure these people endured every night, every week, year after year. Which aspect of this nightlife do you think was the most difficult? The physical cold, the real threat of predators, or the constant psychological stress of uncertainty? Please suggest topics related to life and survival in the Wild West that you would like to see in future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.